Herzlichen Dank erstmal für die Hilfe hier am Computer.
Cordial thank you for the assistance here at the computer. I always need it. It shows from which age I come, and I would like to bring you back to those ages. On my biography, for 10 years or more than 10 years, I worked at the Technical University of Graz. By the way, the first female professor there. You will notice from my presentation, the Austrian element or the Viennese element plays a role in my work. Second request. When I designed my talk under a title, I thought that I would be able to squeeze in everything in just 30 minutes that was necessary to be discussed. I will part ways from this concept. I will focus on Walter Gropius for the single reason that Gropius is the one Bauhaus director who enjoys the least reputation. People don't like him any longer. But is this justified? Let's wait and see. Another thing on my interpretation of the universal, I found it recently in a contribution by Susan Neiman. She is director here in Potsdam of the Einstein Forum. I would like to read this out to you. The core of enlightenment is universalism. Both from the left and from the right, it has come under suspicion. We've just heard in the previous talk how it reads today. Carl Schmitt's claim, whoever voices humanity wants to cheat will be accepted by both sides. Only just a few would make propaganda for Heidegger's Völkisch history concept. Many others from the left say that universalism is just an alibi for Eurocentrism. However, universalism does not come from desire to flatten out all the differences between people and peoples. No, it comes from the claim that everybody enjoys the same right and the right duty to think for themselves. I would like to illustrate something of this process of thinking for themselves. The modern world of the 20th century announced itself in a double figure, in a shining design. It embodied the energetic, futuristic project of industrialization and urbanization, a new pleasure of life, existential liberalism, behind whose back, however, you had the ambiguous dark side, and it was formed in a dramatic new way. With this dark side, we link today the genesis of the economic crisis and political catastrophe of an unfettered war technology of 1914 that developed subcutaneously in the environment of an ingenuous futuristic thought that had as a prerequisite the increasingly technologically modern world as a dominated continuum of rational action. So much. In this context, very briefly, the pictures that you are seeing here are meant as a subtext. In this context, the beautifully and fascinating side of modernity had presented itself to the glances of peoples at the world exhibitions. From time to time, the promises were seen in the wealth of commodities and also a convenient life with a prospect at a future free of any cares. So a peaceful competition amongst nations was not to be seen only in London, Paris, Vienna, or Chicago, or San Francisco. Those who were excluded experienced these new engines for the production of things thanks to the newcomers of technological reproducibility. You could read newspapers, magazines, and they were freely available, for example, in coffee shops or in the bourgeois milieu by subscription. So the world population, most of the times the Western world population, became acquainted with the most sophisticated technological apparatuses. There were pieces of furniture, drapery, and also forgery in iron, printing and looms with cotton. They were looking askant at a new clientele of consumers. I quote, "The popular character of trades jumps into your eyes in a rather elating mood." So much from Walter Benjamin from a publication on the history of the French Workers' Association of 1864. In this context of popularity, you could see new staff architecture of iron, the engineering constructions, as you could admire them in the framework constructions in the halls of the World Exhibition. Everything found an equal space, anything that was counted as part and parcel of the universal process of civilization. Apart from the archaeological trophies cast in plaster, you found also paraphernalia of extra-European cultures, and even the modern apparel of iron war represented the course of the world, so to speak, as a conglomerate of universal history. The products of these world exhibitions unfolded a modern potential for destruction and catastrophe, pronouncing this. However, it was suppressed and not taken note of in this euphoria. Still, the new war paraphernalia were seen as any other item, as an object of feasibility, without any suspicion. They seem to have stepped onto the podium of the world market as any other commodity. The company Clouseau that you may see here produces parts in ironmongery that are excellent products for cooking. This aspect of a, so to speak, interest-free productive forces, the machinery that seemed to bind together with a trend to the mass production, has been taken to the fore once again in the millennium year 1900, when the World Exhibition was organized in the world capital of the 19th century, i.e. Paris. For the very first time, the beaming light of enlightenment presented itself in generosity with a technological, spacious variant, pre-announcing the victory of electrification of urban or industrial spaces, as well as those of the private households, in a plethora of things. It presented a changed worldview in the form of free time, leisure time. The leisure time was invented for the working people. Electric illumination of night, at any rate, offered effectively a new and innovative subdivision of time and use of time with which especially the bourgeois Europeans linked the elating forecast of a well-shaped lifestyle. These trends were subcutaneously also linked to the specifically American instinct for the equality of human beings, i.e., with the democratic society as established in America, was pre-announced here. To that matter, Alexis de Tocqueville's sensational description of America of 1835-40 was a good read. He had told you that this democratic society of Americans produced a special form of passion. I quote, we will see, that could be read in Tocqueville, that amongst all passions that are aroused by equality or favored by equality, there is one passion that is triggered and is also rooted in the hearts of all people. It is the love of wealth. The sense of wealth is, so to speak, the outstanding and indelible characteristic of democratic times. End of quote from Tocqueville. In the dream worlds of those big world exhibitions of the 19th century, these signatures of American wealth were already pre-configured with an immense love for material enjoyment. The new pleasure of life directed towards the new century could reflect this passion both in a luxurious environment as well as in the cheap entertainment for the populace. At any rate, those world presentations seemed to pre-announce a new, easygoing, wealthy existence that was based upon the unfettered technological modernity of everyday life between mobility, telecommunications, and the electric light bulb. Once again, you can see here the World Exhibition 1889, the centenary of the French Revolution, the colonial exhibition. Now, if in the wake of these technological civilizatory accelerations, the exhibitions were seen as the telos-driven world culture, so in the awareness of the initiators, the universality of equality of all human beings was visualized. And a claim was made that this was a tribute to the claim for justice of the Enlightenment. But this impulse also denoted the political moving sands in which those feudally aristocratic dominated European colonial societies were moving effectively. Because as much as you were removed from the fulfillment of this claim to equality in the social space, as strongly as the classes were separated in modern European class societies until 1980, and to who this appropriation of technological products was possible, and under which requirements these productions were adapted, and who benefited from them. That could be taught only by the glance at the real life conditions of men, women, and children of different ages at various places of the growing large cities. This dream world of the good life, the performative potential of those huge world exhibition spectacles could not hide completely the fine differentiating lines between the modern urban industrialized existence. The brute force could be detected only with a glance at the everyday life of human beings beside those productions of dreams. And I have here injected a picture that was not in my original design. Please, one step back. Effectively, only the participatory observation could also detect the everyday rhythms and also the localization of these sharp edges. And this opened up the look at those pre-revolutionary formations of societies that collapsed all over Europe after World War I. Beside the empirical anthropological sites and the political writings of socialist actors as presented in 1845 by Friedrich Engels in his study on the situation of the working classes in England. It was around 1910 that bourgeois liberals, sociologists, politicians, social reformers of both genders that looked after those questions of the formative factors of everyday lifestyle and life conduct in the dominant urban societies. Because how was everyday life structured? How did they work? How did they live? How did they celebrate their feast? How did they recover from the drudgery of life? How did they fare, all those that the 19th century had driven into the European industrialized metropolises? We will jump over this, gentlemen. Now, amongst others, Martin Buber, born in Vienna, was dedicated to this knowledge project. He was also a student of the sociologist Georg Simmel. This design was made by Peter Berns in 1906, 1 year before he became a staff member of AEG and also Mies. And he had also worked for de Corbusier. Amongst the authors that Buber collected on individual topics of collective sociologies, amongst them Social Democrat Eduard Bernstein, who studied the topic of strike, were, of course, Georg Simmel and also architect and art critic Karl Scheffler, but especially the capitalism researcher Werner Sombart, who was teaching then at the Berlin Trade Academy. Sombart's publication opened the plethora of Gesellschaft in 1906 on the living conditions of the proletariat in large cities. In this context, he studied the implications of technology that had been celebrated as the happiness to entire humankind through electrification. However, the concrete shape was deeply class-specific, that the artificial daylight had led to new forms of wage work by nighttime. And this structured the various individuals in a totally differing way. And it was described by Sombart in his text under the title Das Proletariat, the proletariat, now in the general stream of the field research. And I will now bring a longer quote from this so that we can picture it vividly. I quote from Sombart. As we relish our self-sufficiency on the sunny side of life, we know precious little about the big suffering and the small joys of all those who walk in the dark. We do not know a thing about the life habits of those swarms of our co-citizens, much worse than the Wahehe, a tribe in German Eastern Africa, because Germany back then was still a colonial power, or the Sinhalese, that are described by very busy travelers and are even shown in our zoos. But when will we ever see somebody from the proletariat of our own country? When will we see how it starts the day, how it passes the day, and how it finishes the day? Well, and I'm still quoting from Sombart. As it starts the day, we will at best learn something when we come home from a ball night or from a poker party, come at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning to our homes, or when we take the early train. Then we will glance in amazement to this very strange world. We did not know, after all, that those thousands, those hundreds and thousands that come in pairs of 2 or 3, silently carrying their work tools or the blue coffee in their hands. They come from long trains. They come from their homes where they have dressed in rather shabby clothes in the beaming light of a torch and have just gulped down a cup of coffee, if any. And they will now drive to the Moloch, while we turn to the other side in coziness in our beds. That now they will start the inmate's life for 11 or 12 hours. It has that. The dominance of capital over body and soul will have started once again. End of quote from Sombart. It is this type of knowledge about the concrete course of the everyday life with which, in the wake of the liberal and socialist critique of society, the reorganization of the commodity production, as well as a changed urban planning policy, began to take their way. Exact knowledge, what people did when, how they ate, how they dressed. In other words, how they used the everyday paraphernalia, provided they had any such things. The rituals and rites that were enjoying in which rooms or dwellings, whether in organized tenements or in villas, or how they would squeeze their practices in between feeding and sexuality. All this was brought to the foreground not only in the series of shining studies by Buber, but also in so many different scientific studies. And these are basically two aspects that then led to new studies by free architects and product designers around 1910. This affected, for one thing, the restructuring of the living conditions in the wake of the intensified machine work, and on the other hand, the bourgeois wealth and proletariat poverty living conditions in modern big cities. Last but not least, for that knowledge about the modern urban everyday structures, the impulse of cultural politics for the leveling out of those class-specific lifestyles of which we were just taught, was inscribed in the various programs of life reform of those decades, as well as the reflection on what work meant under the conditions of the capitalist organized production. Which values, which attitudes in life, which coercions, which linguistic or habitual expressive forms needed to be analyzed and to be modernized, also, so to speak, in the spirit of the universalist worldview should be reasoned differently. All this came to the fore in the hunger revolts of the World War, in the Bolshevik October Revolution of 1917, and the German November Revolution of 1918. All this was renegotiated. Amongst this mixture of problems of everyday praxis, Bauhaus work was ideally also involved from the very foundation in Weimar. More than anything else, it is the enlightened universal idea of equality and just distribution that made up the intellectual core of Bauhaus, as well as the training courses in the various phases that it undertook between 1919 and 1933. Bauhaus architecture, and I mentioned this already, I will limit myself to the one man who is no longer to the liking of the times, Walter Gropius, participated in the scientifically documented knowledge about the universality of a livelihood in everyday life. In this context, knowledge about households, about habits, and also the requirement level of the market were statistically available or were being collected. Now, this knowledge should be transferred into the design and concrete construction of houses and everyday objects that even those underprivileged could participate in wealth. Because, after all, had not everybody everybody similar fundamental needs for the livelihood? Hadn't there always been something like a universal canon of needs in the wielding of necessary things like eating, sleeping, and the production of everyday paraphernalia, as well as the needs that needed to be fulfilled? Hadn't there always been such a thing as a universally organized household practice? I think those of you, and I require that this is certain, what you see here. Gropius, fully convinced of its reality, paid tribute to this in 1927 in his essay on the systematic preparatory work for rational residential building. And I quote from him, "The majority of the individuals have homogeneous needs in their life. Therefore, it would be logic," and I quote, "these homogeneous mass needs needed to be fulfilled in a unified way, because the everyday life," and that is Henri Lefebvre, "consists in triviality and repetitions." Lefebvre put it that way in his later analysis of everyday life. So it did make sense to quantify all the things of everyday life according to statistical requirements, and to find also typological solutions in the area of construction and building that represented this triviality of repetitions. In this awareness, Gropius didn't think it justified that every house had a different plan, a different outside design, a different style, different construction materials. That was a waste of efforts and also a misleading stress on the individual. End of quote from Gropius. So in a pragmatic and very functional way, those unified residential units were designed that were still designed by Gropius under the requirement of a variability of this homogeneity through a variety of combinatory methods. Let me point out the design approach of Gropius in his first toolbox that was meant to allow for an individualization of buildings. This is a basic idea which the pre-constructed house architects use to the present day. Gropius started out with the pre-requirements of the mass production in precast construction element. It was not only he who believed that the house production could be made much cheaper, so that rents and purchase prices could be lowered. That was a big mistake, and we are still in the fangs of this mistake. With the multiplication of typologies of construction and residential types, Gropius wanted to correct what he called the false stress on the individual. The correct and the lived individuality of the modern man integrated into social groups, and he was thinking of the Austrian Adolf Loos. This could be achieved only through a change in the mentality of use. The mentality that parted ways from the luxurious, from the excessive. Correspondingly, the term of individuality in the reduced and homogenized facades of a cubically defined bauhaus house, be it as a lone standing house, be it also as a residential dwelling, or also as a line of houses. Architectural variations and decorative details were limited to the stressing of structural elements or joints of materials. Now, what was integrated under these flat roofs was inspired by those American love for the wealth that led to the technologically optimized household between the washing machine, the cooking tools, and also precast furniture. Technization of the everyday household and the flexible light furniture were integrating and complementing each other in a comfort effect They promised an added free leisure time, especially for the housewife. In this area of the private room design, through the users and dwellers, it concretized what is then called in the architecture of modernity the individually special. And this was then seen as the lifestyle of living and leisure time. Fitness, physical fitness in the healthy air with a small garden, as well as the consumerist flânerie of the new middle classes in the artificially lighted big cities.
The light choreography of everyday light, as Gropius presented it in the Meisterhäuser in Dessau as the prototypes of a good housing architecture, has created a dream of a good life for all population classes of the population in the early 20th century. But until 1933, residuals of these signatures of wealth have become integrated in the planning of single-family houses, in rental block planning, as we can find them in Dessau, in Siemensstadt in Berlin, and in other settlements in Stuttgart or Vienna. Under the pressure of the economic and political crises, the social-politically founded functionalism, which has propagated the commonly used households, has become more and more problematic, even though architects like Alexander Klein tried their best. Those were successful who made architecture become a single space for management. When the former colleague of Gropius, Ernst Neufert, in 1936 published his book on building designs, this handbook was a simple book of using and planning, focusing on standards and norms. The planning technocracy uses the human body as a simple, unspecific materials that can be used as the basis for planning. In the housing models of Neufert, the everyday household practice has not any chance to be used as an autonomous, specific lifestyle decision. And here again, it becomes visible, this dark side of the double figure or the double face of the modern world, which I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. I come to the end of my presentation. And let me ask the question, what remains of the idea of the Bauhaus, which is linked to the project of the technically modernized living comfort and the dream of a good life for everybody? The postmodern criticism in the second half of the 20th century had long got rid of the social political impulse as an architecture of good intentions, as Colin Rove called it. It was marginalized and laughed about. But I still would like to put a focus on the dream potential. I follow the scientific task, which was begun by Bruno Latour in his book, Existence, Ways of Existence, Anthropology of the Modern. We can read that the objective of an anthropology of the modern is also to to take stock of the modernity in order to know what we should inherit. See this as a side note to the knowledge project of the everyday life. That the ideas of the Bauhaus remain valid in the second half of the 20th century, but at the same time were corrected and transformed, becomes visible in the international style. Already the name international style speaks of a certain claim to universality, which is often overlooked. So a trend which is also visible in the fascination of the European modern architecture, which is fascinated with building traditions of Asia. Another aspect of structuralism was taken up in the 1960s, and there's something which I forgot to show you. Here you can see who is working in this field. So one used the attempts of modern architects as the basis, their attempts to integrate elements in the uniformity of the densified building housing blocks, elements which created some individualization of the design strategies. And this led to ideas and to attempts to create terraces in the densified building structures, as it was done by several architects. And later on, large projects were then created, like in this terrace structure in different parts in Vienna, for instance, but also here in Berlin. And here in Berlin, it was Georg Heinrichs who did this. Another project which is similar and which focuses on the universalistic idea of the equality of all people and combines them with a high level of individuality, was built in Montreal for the World Fair in 1967. I was there in summer, and I could see that what I'm going to tell you now is really the case. The architect Moshe Safdie, who was born in Israel, had the possibility to erect a housing complex which consisted of 354 prefabricated concrete boxes. He followed the structure of a skyscraper, but he dissolved it in a honeycomb structure and coupled it longitudinally to other building elements, and this created a structure of dwelling compartments that are linked to each other by squares and hallways and passages. And these communication ways are adapted to the dwelling units, and the outside terraces are integrated in such a way that every single dwelling unit has a healthy amount of light, air, and sun. And this opens up zones of communication which create a link to the everyday activity. If today we go through this settlement in Montreal, which is nearly 50 years old, we can see in this quarter, which is very beautiful, very light, very calm, we can see the realization of a possibility that shows that there is something specific also in the standards. But maybe this way of existence is only an intermediary stop in modern world architecture, and maybe it is only temporal housing for the modern man. And maybe this, in the words of Bruno Latour, is also only there in order to house the masses who are caught somewhere between the dystopia of economy and the utopia of ecology. But, again, in the words of Latour, humility would be treason. But what does humility mean? I thank you.